So I was watching some of the videos on your site earlier, and I just love them. And one of the things that you mentioned was that cancer opened up a path of inquiry, a road trip into the psyche, if you will, for you.
Yes.
Let's talk about that a little bit because I think that's part of the power of a traumatic event like cancer is it splits our world wide open.
It really does. And that's exactly what it did for me. I was just thinking about this, Pat. I was thinking about the dreams I used to have. For years and years, I dreamed about this huge mansion that had all these fascinating rooms and all these different floors, but there was one room I wouldn't go into that I was terrified of. And, I'd try the door and it was locked or something, but for years, repeating dream. And I think that's what cancer did. It opened that door for me. And this also makes me recall what certain primitive cultures believe about cancer, which is that, or not just cancer, but any trauma, any sudden illness, severe illness, is that it's a gateway. There's a narrow portal being presented to us when we have these severe traumas that open up to a totally different dimension if we take the opportunity. And that's what I did. It was a really interesting situation because the universe was like forcing me to do this, to take I call this the cosmic cattle prod. This is huge. I think cancer is that, if ever there was one. But I was in the process of moving back to New Mexico after living in Hawaii for 20 years. And when I was diagnosed with cancer, I just gotten a little cabin in the woods that was far away from everything as humanly possible. And I got the diagnosis and came home and went, okay, the four people I knew in New Mexico were all, in the Bahamas or something, and one had pneumonia. So it was like, okay, this is very obvious. This is not going to be about talking to people and wondering what their opinions are. This is going to be me going deep, really, really deep. And back in the 1970s, I'd had a teacher who opened all this up for me, really in a big way, a very different way of looking at life. And I, at that moment, when I was diagnosed with cancer, had the opportunity to take all those teachings fully into my body, all the way in, and go right from the start. Okay, one of my teacher's things was, everything that comes to you is for your benefit.
I
So
love that one. And there were, I don't mean to interrupt, but back up. There were actually three things your teacher said. And I think they're all powerful, although everything that happens to you is for your benefit is, I think, maybe my favorite. I just love that one.
and I went from that perspective. I said, take that. See, that's the whole thing with my work, is that it's a perspective that I don't want to jam it down people's throats and make them say this is the truth, but rather this is a way, a fascinating new way to look at health and healing and why we get illness, and explore, just as you would if you just entered Greece or something like that. It's just like, let's see what's here. And what I found was it was such an effective inquiry, just taking that one perspective to begin with, because it just led naturally, boom, 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 right down to all the way to the depths of the stuff that I didn't want to look at at all. And it took a life or death situation for me to finally look at it, finally open Pandora's box on certain things. And it yielded phenomenal treasure, mind-blowing treasure.
No, I think cancer forces you to reassess things in a number of ways. Certainly internally, just like you're talking about, but also externally. So much of your social support network often falls apart. Um, you can find yourself very isolated. You can be financially devastated. You may come out on the other end missing a body part or not in the same physical condition you once were. Chemo brain can turn your world upside down. There are so many both external events that happen that shake up your world. And I think to some extent, the portal that you're talking about, the opportunity, is to almost transcend these terrible external events that are happening and go within.
Absolutely, and trust in that moment that in the going within is it's this very ugly package that you've been given that doesn't smell good and looks terrible, but if you dare unwrap it, there's enormous treasure in there. And so it takes a lot of courage. You know, cancer takes a lot of courage, period. But it's so worth this journey. I just want to, you know, I don't think there's a day that goes by that I don't thank cancer, because it pushed me to finally break through so many things that I've been lagging on.
Well, one of the other things that your teacher said was that you create your own reality with thought.
Yes, yes. And there's the big 180-degree shift. Really, if you take it all the way, he said that belief comes first, then perception. And hallelujah, finally, I studied all this stuff in the 70s, and believe me, all my friends thought I was completely nuts. I was in graduate school while they thought I was nuts. And but today, science is finally proving this is true. I saw the most fascinating, read about the most fascinating experiment where scientists separated people from their own DNA, and then put movies on for them about, you know, different super emotionally charged things, right? And lo and behold, in real time, the DNA reacted to their emotions, separated by a room, and then separated by 50 miles.
I've been reading about a lot of studies along these lines, and they're fascinating, aren't they?
Yeah, we create our own reality. And it's really time that we as a culture, as a society, as a global community begin to really take this on. And this is what I did with cancer, is say, I did this to myself. And immediately, Pat, what happens with that and why it's so hard for people to take responsibility is because then you go into guilt. And that's what a lot of my work is about, is clearing that layer of guilt, because it's completely inappropriate. Guilt is not a true thing. It's been, you know, hundreds of years of conditioning have taught us that guilt is appropriate and correct. It's all 1,000 judgments leaped upon thousands of other judgments. And you know that the really, were you going to say something?
No, no, go ahead.
I think that the very best word that symbolizes this 180-degree flip is the word sin. All right, so sin represents, sin is the symbol of a state of mind in which one feels that one has done something that is unforgivable, that is so bad that only punishment will come along and fix it. And, but, you know, and we all live in this, whether we're conscious of it or not. This idea has permeated our souls and created enormous, what I call like emotional prisons, mental prisons. Because really, if you really believed that, you couldn't even step left or step right. You wouldn't dare to, because maybe it's a sin, maybe it's some irreparable, you know, terrible thing. But once upon a time, sin meant something completely different. And this is the 180 shift. It meant missing the mark. It was an archery term. Now, really, if you really want to learn how to miss a mark, I mean, to hit a mark, what do?
You keep going until you keep going and missing until you finally get it.
Exactly. And every single mistake you make leads to your success eventually. So in this paradigm, you know, mistakes are applauded. They're like, good, you're getting closer, fantastic, instead of, oh, what have you done now? You know?
Oh, I think it's a much more powerful paradigm to celebrate accomplishment in a positive way, rather than a positive and also a non-judgmental way, if that's possible, rather than constantly critiquing things. And we live in a society that's very hard on us. And I think particularly now we've gotten to the point where, oh, nobody can ever be good enough for anything. We live in an airbrushed, pseudo-perfect world that doesn't really exist anywhere, and yet we're supposed to live up to these ideals. And I think that reality is actually far more complex and far more interesting.
Yes, and far less judgmental. Don Juan in the whole Castaneda series said, you know, we only came here to have experiences. Imagine that. We just came to have experiences. We did not come to judge those experiences. And there's the whole problem right there.
Well, if you start looking at life as a series of experiences to have, a series of learning experiences,
right?
What an interesting way to go through life. Think about how different one's choices might be.
Oh boy, you're not kidding. You're not kidding. Really different. Yeah. So,
Let's talk a little bit about, I love you use the phrase, the art of thought, to talk about the power of choice. And the art of thought, that's such an elegant phrase. I just love it.
yes, me too. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. So basically what I was taught is there's basically two dimensions inside of us. Okay, so this comes back to the matrix, right? So because of how we're raised and how we're conditioned in childhood, and that conditioning has been taught for hundreds of years, and we very much tied punishment with, we guilt trip our children, then we punish them. I mean, a lot of people do. And that, and then there's all the assessments, the evaluations of better than, less than that go all the way through society, all the way through school, all the way through higher learning. It's always about, grading, assessing. Are you good enough? Think about, assessing your own body when you were.
Or he who dies with the most toys wins. Talk about ridiculous assessments.
Oh, exactly. And what our ideas of success are, all of those things. So what that breeds inside of us basically are two very distinct personalities. We're all very schizophrenic. And one is this conditioned personality that has become either the pleaser or the rebel or the, cast out of society. But in whatever way, whether it's in, rebelling against it or being in it, it is not an authentic personality. So we've got the authentic personality versus this conditioned personality. And these two are at total odds within us. And if we began a list of all the conflicts within us, we would find thousands because we're constantly, self against self. Now I'm saying this is one of the major causes of disease because you've got self against self, which creates friction, which in turn creates heat, which in turn creates inflammation, which everybody's saying is the sole cause of disease right now. Thought is the way to bridge the two personalities, the two characters, the two beings inside of ourselves. And, my teacher used to say, you're much too tolerant of mind wandering. Every thought you have is either contributing to a much better life for you, a much more peaceful life, or a much harder life. I'm kind of exaggerating, but it's really true. I mean, how I think about that chair doesn't matter that much, but when you begin to really watch your thoughts, then you begin to see that there's a bunch of garbage in there and a lot of put downs and a lot of negativity. And actually disciplining and training the mind is the whole name of the game. Because once you see what you're thinking and you see how destructive those thoughts are and how much they're hurting your life or your health, then you begin to choose which ones to have and which ones not to have. And that's all of creation right there.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, I think the power of choice is very real and very profound. To this day, I know when I was going through my second round of chemo, I could not eat. And I wasn't going to die from not eating, but it was just as if a life force had been ripped away from me. And one of the things I realized is I had to eat for nutrition. I simply had to get good quality nutrition into my body. And that power of choice moment, if you will, changed forever how I viewed food and the choices I make. And to this day, I will look at a situation, a sandwich, and if I can put arugula on it rather than iceberg lettuce, I choose the arugula because it has better nutritional content. And that's maybe a very tangible way of looking at the power of choice. But once you start becoming aware, whether it's of your mind, of your food, of your activity, of your interactions with others, whatever it is, now you have an opportunity to choose. That's incredible.
It's so incredible, and completely different worlds arise from your choices. And that's
Yes.
what's so important. You look at you and the choices you made around cancer, and they're night and day. You could have sat home and been in your, felt terribly sorry for yourself and been thinking about cancer all the time, which is the huge danger. But you went on a huge adventure,
Yeah,
right?
I've come to the point of thinking that one of the reasons I'm here at least is for adventure.
Right, you did. You chose what gave your soul wings,
Yeah.
literally. But you could have chosen to stay home and be all cranky about the whole thing, right?
Yeah, I think we all have those choices to make. And I think I know for me, meditation has been a profound influence over the last decade. It has certainly helped to rewire my brain. I believe between the chemo, which didn't help anything, and meditation and whatnot, I really think my brain is substantially different than it was 10 years ago. It would be so interesting to be able to look at, the two brains side by side because I know they'd be very different.
Oh, I totally agree. Just knowing that I have choices and those choices change my reality. Talk about change your brain. I'm no longer, at the effect of life. I'm steering the ship.
I was at a meeting recently. It was very interesting. A psychologist was talking, and she was really getting kind of dark, and you could feel the energy in the room just go down. And I realized that there were many people in that room that liked that low energy, that just reveled in it. How do you help people? How do you get somebody out of that low energy state to start seeing the power of choice and start seeing these possibilities?
Well, a lot of people come to me knowing that already feeling there's some other way to deal with this. They're very depressed at that point. And just letting them know that there is another way of looking at all of this immediately starts brightening them up. It's quite fast because it's just like I think sometimes cancer diagnosis as things are right now can be a very dead end street. There's very little hope. There's very little light in the situation. But really realizing that we have so much more power in our minds than we realize, I think gives people a lot of hope. And then, I also, go ahead, Pat.
No, no, I think the treatment reality is one that fosters victimhood and dependence. And
Yes.
it's very hard to balance that, to balance your fear and the lack of information, because there's no one place to go for all the information you want and need. And then to try to figure out what is the best path for you, it's an impossible task, frankly. And then to try to come out of it in a good psychological place. We have no roadmap for this. And I think that's one of the things that certainly motivates me with Cancer Road Trip is the fact that we 40% of us will have a cancer diagnosis in our lifetime. That's astonishing right there. And that's from the American Cancer Society. There's something just so wrong with our matrix. And I think a big part of it is the psychological piece, the way we have built the society. As you were saying earlier, the way we contrast and compare things constantly. We measure things constantly. I think that we do have to find a different way. I think we need to redesign this matrix in a way that is much more human, much more forgiving, and a lot more fun.
Yes. Oh, yes, Pat. Things have gotten very, very serious, that's for sure. God. Yeah. And, thought is the beginning of all of that. In the Bible, in the beginning was the word. And I don't think there's anybody, any of the great masters disagree with that. We have to come back to the discipline of thought. We're just letting our minds go completely wild in this society right now and consequently creating a mass world that isn't working. So
And we've become totally reactive. We don't think we have a 3-second attention span, and we're constantly amused by the latest bauble or whatever appears on our phone screen. I mean, I've seen my own attention span decrease. And one of the things I do to fight it is I make it a point to read books. I turn off my phone, I walk away, and I read a book because it forces me to be there, to be present, and to hold on to these skills of concentration.
yes, yeah, exactly. Skills of concentration are getting lost in this culture, and it's everything. Holding a thought, holding an intention. Intention is a very big piece of all of this, Pat. It's scary because it's like, the very first thing when I got back to my little cabin that day in meditation, it was like, what do you want to come of this, Wendy? What do you want? There's the end of victimhood. And in that moment, I went, okay, I want this, this, and this, sort of like the character goals. And then I have the physical goals. And that was a huge moment for me and having to come back to that moment over and over and over. And I still do. There's these days where you're tired and you go, oh my God, and you wonder what's going on in your body. And, to come back to your intention is a very powerful thing. Also, to write it down in great detail. What is it going to look like in a year from now? You decide what you want from all of this. That's what's incredible about it.
And it does take it takes practice, training, mental energy. There's no question about it. And this isn't something we teach.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm so excited about my work, because that is what I'm teaching. It's like, how do you do this? How do you find the gift that's in cancer? In order to find it, I had to go through guilt. I had to set intentions. I had to realize I was incredibly conflicted. The major conflict, after I went through that huge list of all my conflicts, was, do you want to live or do you want to die? Because if I had attracted a serious illness, clearly a part of me was leaning in that direction towards death. And making that conscious was an extraordinarily important part of my journey. Because then I looked at all the things on that list and went, wait a minute, I do want to live. And these things on the I want to die list are all the things that are blocking me. And if I want to get better, I have to fix these. And certainly, cancer is asking one thing very clearly. You need to change. You need to really, like you were saying right in the beginning, really shake stuff up, right?
Well, and it's an opportunity. I mean, some of this is beyond our ability to control or whatever. People die, and it's just it's a reality. But I think that in that period of time that you have between, say, being diagnosed and if you don't have a very good prognosis, it's an opportunity to go back and revisit things and find some peace and clarity with your own soul. And I think that's incredibly important.
And become conscious of really what it is you do want. I think a lot of people are hanging towards the death side and aren't conscious of it. And,
Well,
and
look at depression is rampant. And I personally think a big piece of depression is our lack of social connection anymore. Johann, I'll look up his name. Actually, let me do that now because his name matters. He's on the New York Times best-selling list right now. I'll come back to this thought in just a second. Just let me find his name. I'll edit this out. Okay. I was saying that first I need water. I think a big piece of this kind of life wish, death wish equation that we were talking about goes to depression. And I think depression is rampant. Johann Hari wrote Lost Connections. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. And he points to the lack of social connection as a real key piece to this, the widespread depression we're seeing. In 2000, he did a survey and asked people, how many people could you call if you really needed help? And I think the average number was 4. He did the same survey a little over a decade later, and the average answer was 0.
man, that gives me chills, and not in a good way.
No, and I think that goes to, I think people's lack of connection on a social level, lack of connection and self-inquiry on a spiritual level lead to this kind of dichotomy of live, die. And the die part can look very powerful when you're in a bad frame of mind and when you don't have the ability to perhaps step outside of yourself and look at your thoughts and recognize that you have a choice. How do you want to frame this?
Exactly. And a lot of depression is just thinking that death is going to save you, that death is going to be the way out of this mess, the way out of all the conflict in our minds and all the self-hatred and all the guilt. And that's the big mistake. I personally, my belief system is that is not the way out. Only really living. My teacher used to say that this world is not left by death but by living. Isn't that a trip?